Welcome everyone to the session called Macron France, En Marche to Business as Usual, and it is organized in association with Newsweek. My name is Nathalie Rothschild. Despite my last name, I did not bankroll Macron's election campaign, just so you know. I'm a journalist based mainly in Stockholm, Sweden. This summer I spent most of my time in France as the Southern Europe correspondent for Sweden's national radio, with the base in Paris, because relative to Sweden, that is Southern Europe. And as you know, anyone who follows French politics, this summer was quite dramatic. After the election, Macron's approval ratings kept dropping quite dramatically. And actually this past week it hit an all-time low, at least according to one survey that showed that only 42% of French people backed Macron. His political opponents now call him the president of the rich, and that was after he signed his so-called pro-business budget last month. And he also, of course, signed a set of controversial executive orders to reform France's labor laws. I'm sure we'll hear more about that in the discussion. He did that signing in a sort of Donald Trump-like ceremony that was aired live on television. And of course, Macron, from the day he was elected, has shown that he's quite fond of ostentatious, regal ceremonies. So what kind of leader is he? What does his presidency mean for France, for Europe, and for the wider world? To discuss that, we have 5 speakers with in-depth knowledge of France and French politics, and I'll introduce them now in the order in which they'll give their introductions, which they have 5 to 7 minutes each to do. So our first speaker will be Robert Toombs, here on my far left, who is an emeritus professor of French history at Cambridge University. He's published widely on modern French history and Franco-British relations, but his latest book is called The English and Their History. Welcome. Our second speaker on the far right is Gerry Feehily, who is an author and journalist, and right now is the Europe editor at the Global Affairs Weekly Courier International. He's lived in Paris since 1990 and has, among other things, reviewed and interviewed a number of famous contemporary French authors. Perhaps the most famous one is Michel Houellebecq, that you've met and interviewed. Welcome, Gerry. Our third speaker will be Josh Lowe, who is a staff writer at Newsweek, the partner for this session. Josh covers Britain and Europe, focusing mainly on politics and policy across the continent. He previously worked at Prospect magazine, where he was part of the digital team. And Naomi Firsht, here next to me, is a staff writer at the online magazine Spiked, where she writes about France, feminism and free speech, among other topics. She has bylines in a number of other publications as well, and spent a lot of time in Paris. She lived there for several years and co-authored the book, The Parisian's Guide to Cafes, Bars and Restaurants. So if you want to go out in Paris, Naomi is the person to give you some tips. And finally, Joseph Downing, who is based at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, here in London, and he's a Marie Curie Fellow at France's National Centre for Scientific Research. He's written widely about politics and sociology in France, concentrating on minority communities. His PhD thesis involved extensive fieldwork in France and looked at the issue of inclusion in 3 cities, Marseille, Paris, and Lyon. Welcome. Great. You are 5 to 7 minutes.
Yes, okay. I was asked to talk about the historical context of Macron. It's a lot to be said about that, and it's an awful lot for 5 to 7 minutes. So the question is, how do we situate him historically? How does he situate himself historically? And in order not to take up too much time, I'm going to just suggest 5 bullet points, which, if you wish to talk about later, we can come back to. One, of course, is the traditional polarization of French politics between right and left, which is very old and goes deep, very deep culturally. I remember a magazine ran a survey some years back which showed that people on the left like Camembert, people on the right like Brie, and so on. And so this went quite deep into the way people thought of themselves and identified themselves. But Macron, of course, comes up through the centre. And I think I would call Macron a populist of the centre, which is new but not unprecedented. Indeed, France's big peacetime political changes have tended to be just that, a rejection of the polarization of left and right, and a claim to be something new. 1848, the election of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte as president. 1958, the coming to power of Charles de Gaulle, both in a sense centrists and both certainly populists. Populism is essentially a one-man band. It's irony in a sense. That's my point one. Point two, declinism. For years now, for generations, the French have convinced themselves that they're a nation in decline, economically, socially, culturally, politically, and that something needs to be done about this, but nobody agrees on what. So Macron's mission is, in a sense, to do something about this. Point three, what's his remedy? Well, it's political centrism, as I said, and it's economic liberalism. Neither of these things popular in France. Indeed, liberalism has been called the ideology that dares not speak its name. Nobody in France wants to be called a liberal, which is associated with American and British neoliberalism and excessive reliance on free enterprise in the market. But nevertheless, that's what his remedy is. How is he going to push things through? And he started, of course, with labour market reforms, cuts in public spending, welfare, defence, cutting the civil services on the cards, and tax reform to help business, or if you prefer, to help the rich. How can he get this through? Well, I suspect one way is to introduce it in homeopathic doses and try to convince people that nothing much is happening, and to show perhaps, or hopefully, that these things are working. For example, that unemployment is coming down and then more will follow. But certainly he seems to be doing it by acting as fast as he can, using the powers of the presidency to push things through. And that brings me to my fourth point, his reliance on the presidency. The powers and the prestige of the presidency, as you said, a quasi-monarchical post. The Fifth Republic Constitution is widely called a republican monarchy, which is what the man who drafted its constitution called it. And the president is not the prime minister, of course. The president is meant to be above politics, to represent the unity of the nation, to direct the nation, to act as sort of helmsman of the nation and direct it in certain broad channels, and leave the rather degrading and dirty business of day-to-day politics to his prime minister and ministers. And Macron obviously loves this, at least he seems to love it, and he seems in some ways to be quite good at it. You would have seen the rather, I thought rather embarrassing, but a lot of people in France loved it, his sort of dramatic march through the dark at the Louvre. And I saw him on the 14th of July acting as rather like a medieval monarch, touching people to cure their ills, hugging weeping people and so on. I thought, well, Princess Diana could do this, William and Harry can do this. People don't mind being hugged and kissed by princes and princesses, but they don't usually like being hugged and kissed by politicians. And that Macron can do this shows at least he can play the part. I mean, the idea is that he's a sort of Jupiterian president, which is the Gaullist, as I said, the Gaullist idea of the presidency. He's already forced the resignation of his widely respected chief of staff of the army. He's demoted his own military advisor. He's told the army that he's commander-in-chief and their job is to obey, not to tell him what to do. Some like this and some don't. I think the French are rather ambivalent, risking a great generalization. They love monarchy in a way, but they also throw out monarchs quite regularly, including de Gaulle. They didn't like Sarkozy and Hollande because they thought they were not dignified enough for the post, but they don't necessarily like people who go over the top and claim to be, above, as it were, above their people. I think a problem it seems to me a problem in Macron playing this role is he has rather a sharp tongue, and phrases can stick to politicians. He said he wasn't on the side of les fainéants, the idle. He told protesting workers they shouldn't foutre le bordel, which is not as rude in French as it is in English, but it's still fairly rude. He's supposed to have told someone who asked about the price of his suit that if you wanted a suit like this, you should work for it. And his most recent boutade in Cayenne was he said, I'm not Father Christmas and you're not children, which the Cayennais didn't like very much. In fact, they rioted. So they obviously did really want the president to be Father Christmas. But so he's not necessarily tactful. You could take this as being refreshing plain speaking, or, of course, you could take this as being the arrogance of a highly privileged young man who made a lot of money very quickly, who thinks of himself as extremely clever, and is, as you said, suspected of being le président des riches. So is he le roi thaumaturge, the hugger and kisser of the suffering, or is he the man who essentially doesn't care a damn about them? My fifth and last point, Europe. A very interesting speech at the Sorbonne last month. He sees himself as the man to save Europe from its existential crisis, but his vision of Europe is a very traditionally French one. It's first of all more Europe, ever more Europe, centralization of tax, education, migration, defense and security, public spending, a Franco-German axis, a hard core of countries around France and Germany, and the others are satellites, including Britain, he said. So the lesser countries who follow at a slower pace. And also he wants Europe's influence to be extended into the old French Empire in Africa. So this de Gaulle would have approved of. Right, okay. Will he be a success in this huge historic task? If he is, it means he reverses decline, he restores economic dynamism, he recreates the Franco-German axis, and he makes France great in the world again. You may have heard his speech at the Louvre, "The world is waiting for France." If he's a failure, what does France fall back on? I don't know. Is he providential, a savior, or is he just a very lucky politician? Maybe providence and luck are really the same thing. Napoleon's supposed to have pinned a medal on the wrong man and then said it doesn't matter, he can keep it because I like lucky generals. He's a lucky politician so far. Is his luck running out or is his luck in? We shall find out over the next few months.
Thank you so much. Gerry.
Yes, well, I'd like to talk, so I've been living in France since 1990, and I'd like to talk a little about that in relation to the notion of work and employment, and in the case of France, unemployment. I actually first went to France in September 1987. I was 19 years old. I was a very engaged young left-wing man who hated Margaret Thatcher with all my heart, and so I was utterly thrilled in 1987 when François Mitterrand was in power to go to this socialist paradise, which I imagined France to be, and not only a socialist paradise, but a world of sophistication and beauty and glamour. And walking around Paris, I was in front of the Pompidou Center and admiring, or, well, not really admiring, I mean, looking at the pipes and the big tubes of the Pompidou Center and wondering whether I should admire it or not. And I noticed on the Place there was this orange sphere, an orange sphere in diameter about 2.5 meters. And within this orange sphere there was a little entrance, and inside it there was a young man. He was 19, he was my age, and he was looking at me, and beside him there was a basket of oranges and a squeezer. And there was a little panel that said, for 5 francs, you can have a glass of orange juice. So I did, and this rather lugubrious, gloomy young man handed my orange juice for 5 francs. And then, looking as gloomy as ever, he took my money and went away. And later on, I saw that there were these orange spheres all over Paris. And I just asked friends, well, you know, what is this? And they said to me, ce sont les chômeurs. You know, they're unemployed people. And it was at this precise moment, you know, I learned that this gloom partly was due to the fact that in France at that time unemployment was at 3 million, and that it was a great obsession. Now, I have to say, in all the years I've been in France, over 25 years, unemployment has remained always at that figure. You know, and every time a president comes to power, you know, he comes in on this sort of wave of solving this question, because it creates this kind of great, I'd say, anguish and anxiety in French society, and it's very revealing. It crystallizes around, I think, the notion of contracts. There are 2 types of contracts you can get in French society. There's one called a CDD, which is a contrat de durée déterminée, so a short-term contract which has a limit. There's another one called a contrat de durée indéterminée, a contract of indeterminate duration. Everyone dreams in France of obtaining a contract of that sort. And because basically what happens when you obtain that type of contract, you're virtually unsackable. It is something that is so sought after in French society that you throw a party at the moment that you get a CDI, because basically you're set up. And this not only in just in this is, you know, you throw a big party, you spend a couple of £100 and get your colleagues drunk, and you know, it's like I just can't imagine something like this happening in the same way in British or in Irish societies. This sort of cause for celebration, and because it's a cause for celebration, it's also a cause for anguish at the same time, and there is this great anxiety in France, and I think it really crystallized under the Chirac presidency, when there was a rather timid reform that Dominique de Villepin, the Prime Minister at the time, tried to bring in a contract du premier embauche, which was basically to solve the problem of youth unemployment, because youth unemployment is you know, it's 25%, and again, it has been so for a very long time. The contrat de premier embauche basically it was a contract for 2 years, was for your first job. It made it easier for you to sack. It also meant that at the end of that contract, you wouldn't be automatically given a CDI, a job for life. And it caused a huge outcry in French life. There was a million people on the streets of Paris. There were protests everywhere, and essentially young, very young people who had actually never had even a sniff of a job. This is 15, 16, 17-year-old people, were often encouraged at school by their teachers, who are civil servants and who have jobs for life, to go out in the street and protest against this contract, which was considered to be far too precarious. And I think that's quite revealing. I think I think that in Britain there's much more perhaps commonsensical or pragmatic approach to the notion of work, which in a way, which is very different in France. So you have 16-year-old people out in the streets, they haven't even done university yet, protesting against a type of contract which would at least give them some stability of unemployment for 2 years. And the millions were out, and of course the government withdrew that. The government folded, and the entire project was dead. And now this is the thing about France. All French presidents, prime ministers are terrified of la rue, the street. And this reveals something, sort of inherent instability of France. France is a terribly unstable country in a way that I think is very difficult to imagine in Britain, where there's just been this incredible continuity, you know, ever since the glorious revolution. So in France, you know, France has been through 5 republics since the French Revolution, as was mentioned earlier, the most recent one being in 1958. Basically, the whole idea of the street coming up is I think it's met with the same apprehension as the aristocrats must have imagined the arrival of a horde of sans-culottes storming the gates. And that instability also is even in the names of the political parties. How many times have the traditionalist right in France changed the name? Since I've been there, about 3 or 4 times. Now they're called les Républicains, but before they were the UMP. Before that, they were the RPR. Before that, it was another name. They're always trying to rebrand, and I think in the face of declinism, always trying to rebrand. I think there's something new in relation. I'll try to come back to this very later about the question of street protests in relation to Macron a little bit later. But I think the game has completely changed under Macron's presidency.
Thank you so much. Josh.
So there are others on the panel who spend more time in France day to day than me, so I'm going to focus in my introduction more on Macron's foreign policy, and specifically his attitude towards Europe. Earlier this year, I went to a media briefing in Westminster with Macron during his flying visit that he made to London. It was during the campaign, at the height of sort of Macron mania. And I remember we all spent a lot of time discussing Brexit, as British journalists tend to do nowadays. And Macron had harsh words for the Remain campaign, which he felt made no kind of positive case for the EU. And summing up a lot of his strategic thinking, he said, in the current environment, if you're shy, you're dead. Since his election, this has been Emmanuel Macron's broad approach to the problem of disenfranchisement with Europe among Europeans. He wants, as he said in a recent Der Spiegel interview, to start a new chapter in Europe. So how bold are his ideas, and will he actually change anything? Well, unlike most politicians, and I don't just mean in Britain, Macron is unafraid to speak of Europe with romanticism. In Greece, in September, for example, he spoke with a pretentiousness that even he could only half pull off. On a hill in front of the Acropolis, he cried it was here that the risk of democracy was taken, and he called for a drive towards democracy in Europe. And where British Brexiters are fond of telling a story in which the EU began as a technical trading union and expanded into an all-encompassing political empire, Macron, in a later speech at the Sorbonne, gave the opposite impression. He lamented a project that had moved, he said, from a promise of peace, prosperity and freedom to inertia, habit, putting our ambition to one side. While during the Brexit campaign, Europe and sovereignty were posed as diametrical opposites, Macron argued at the Sorbonne that you cannot have one without the other. Only Europe, he said, can guarantee genuine sovereignty or our ability to exist in today's world to defend our values and interests. So to turn to the central question of the panel, is any of this really so radical? Before we come to the substance of Macron's policy proposals for Europe, I would just say that talking about Europe in the way that he does, while not exactly tantamount to a revolution, does mark him out from other European leaders. Of course, compared to British politics, where until recently politicians tried to avoid banging on about Europe altogether, continental politics everywhere is more EU-heavy. But most leaders talk about EU reform through narrow national interest prisms. I think, for example, of the outgoing Austrian Chancellor Christian Kern, who talked about countries that don't take refugees being denied subsidies from Brussels. And it was couched as a grand proposal, but it was in fact the first salvo in the approaching national bun fight over cash that is going to ensue when Britain takes its money out the door. And then there are the voices of the hard right, who are not afraid to put forward their own visions of Europe, highly critical of the EU as they are, whether it's Viktor Orban's illiberal democracy or Marine Le Pen's Europe of nations and freedom. But Macron is doing what his fellow liberal centrists all over the world have often struggled to do. He is trying to make an emotionally engaging and intellectually persuasive, active case for his position. He is arguing for European solidarity and unity unashamedly, and even if you disagree, you have to acknowledge, if not admire, the effort. As for the substance of those proposals, Macron, in his Sorbonne speech, predicted dismissively that the next day, those without any ideas of their own, by which I assume he means journalists, will be focusing on the sticking points. But it is, of course, right to focus in here on whether his ideas will change anything. And the verdict is, in many cases, that it's far too early to assume success or failure. He wants a common Eurozone budget, for example. The success of that will depend partly on the cooperation or otherwise of Germany. And while Angela Merkel has made clear that she is open to talking about the issue, and a renewed spirit of Franco-German cooperation is in itself a Macron achievement, the two have substantial ideological differences on how this will function. Macron has also correctly identified that many across Europe feel its openness is too often to the benefit of elites rather than the working classes. But some of his proposals to fix this are small fry. He successfully secured the reform this month of EU rules governing workers posted across national borders, for example, but those policies relate to just 1% of the EU workforce. And Macron is himself not above a good old-fashioned national bun fight. One early major act of this supposed ultra-neoliberal torchbearer was to nationalise a shipyard in order to piss off the Italians, which is a move about as typically French as unfriendly waiting staff. So business as usual, time will tell in practice, but in theory at least, he is seeking to foster a climate in which the direction of Europe as a whole can be more openly debated, and its proponents hope actually sold to sceptical publics. In that sense, his election had the potential to change the course of history. Now it's on him to actually deliver it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Naomi.
Okay. So, first of all, I want to revisit the French election. We are coming up to almost 6 months of Macron's presidency, and that's really quite incredible when you think, especially for those of us outside of France, we'd only just heard of him around a year ago. So something significant definitely happened here. And when I think back to the election, what really struck me, and I'm sure struck a lot of us, was the hype surrounding it when it got to the second round of voting between Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron. The hype surrounding Macron, he was really the media darling in France and abroad, And it was really kind of portrayed as this battle of good versus evil, and can Macron beat the evil witch Le Pen? And I think when you get caught up in the hype, it's easy to forget that when Macron first announced his bid for the presidency, his victory was by no means a foregone conclusion. It's important to remember that this was an extremely volatile election. It was full of surprises. François Fillon winning the right primary was not expected, and when he first won, he very much looked like the front runner to win the election. Then we saw Benoît Hamon win the left primary. Again, this was not what was supposed to happen, and it really highlighted the division in the Parti Socialiste. And then we had the fake job scandal emerge, where it was alleged that Fillon had been paying his family to do fake jobs. And it was only then, really, once that scandal broke and the Republican Party started to sort of implode as well, that Macron really started polling well. This was around, I think, January time. And what's interesting is that at that time, he hadn't actually released his political program. So there was already all this hype surrounding him and no real political substance behind it. When we talk about this idea that Macron is perhaps heralding some kind of new politics, I actually think he's more of, actually, as Robert said, a lucky politician. He's the result of the traditional left and right-wing parties collapsing in on themselves, creating a political vacuum, and which he benefited from. Now, then, of course, he won the election, and we all knew he would. And this was celebrated by all the liberal elites across the world. I'm sure we all remember Hillary Clinton's tweet, "This is a victory not just for France, but for Europe and for the world." I mean, if she could have fit the galaxy in there too, I'm sure she would have. And, it was celebrated by the EU leaders. So again, we heard a lot of commentary about Macron representing some kind of anti-elite politics or anti-establishment politics. And I really just find that idea laughable, because the reason his victory was so celebrated by Hillary Clinton, by the EU, was because he is one of them. He has an establishment background. He is a technocrat through and through. That's why they were so pleased. They were relieved. A few weeks ago, he gave this TV interview for the first time. And afterwards, the French newspaper Libération described his political vision as managerial. And I think that's exactly what it is. He is a political manager. And remember, he'd never been elected before as a politician. So I think also this idea that Macron winning also prevented any kind of populist surge across Europe is just is patently not true, because we can see in very recent elections, the Czech election last week, the Austrian election before it, ADF doing so well in the German election, he hasn't prevented any other kind of populist surge at all. And of course, whilst he won the French election, Marine Le Pen came second. Which, while she lost badly, she actually did very well for a Front National leader. And I think it's important to remember that. So lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about the French people, the voters. I'm someone who, I lived in Paris for quite a while, have French family, French friends. I went back there to cover the election. So I have a bit of an insight into, I think, how French people were feeling at the time of the election. And what struck me most, really, was that people didn't know who to vote for. I was talking to friends, in the month before the election, no one had inspired them. They were struggling, they were fed up with all the scandals, the surprises, because it really started to feel like a substitute for any kind of real politics. This feeling of kind of disillusionment with the whole political system really showed in the abstention rates, which was 25% for the presidential election. So, meaning 1 in 4 French people couldn't even be bothered to vote against Le Pen. And again, after the election, we saw that many people had just come out to vote against Le Pen rather than for Macron. And this disillusionment was repeated again a month later in the parliamentary elections, when the abstention rates were over 50%, which is shockingly high. So I think this idea that Macron brought some kind of new, inspiring politics, it's difficult to believe, because he's not really even convincing the French people, as far as I'm concerned. And so to conclude for me, Macron is really a very fitting president for today's France. I recently, in a recent article, I called him a bit of a Gallic shrug of a president. I really feel like there's this air of resignation in France today. The atmosphere is quite low, and that's, I think, because of a combination of these terror attacks that have been happening over the past few years, and because of the high unemployment. And I think French people were really looking for someone new to believe in, some kind of new political vision in this election, and they didn't get it, and so they just resigned themselves to the least worst option. And I would say Macron is just doing exactly what he said he would do. He's running France like a startup and being a political manager.
Okay, thank you so much. Joseph.
Thank you. Hi, I've come here to talk to you today to give a kind of bit of a different spin on contemporary France. I'm a political sociologist, and I've been working on France now for the best part of a decade, and my research has focused on mainly disadvantaged minority ethnic communities within France, so the suburbs in large French cities in particular, Paris, Lyon and Marseille, where I've done the majority of my work in Marseille. So I have quite a different perspective on, I think, a lot of issues in French politics because of that. And also, I want to link this to these broader questions to both the Macron campaign and also Macron as a president. So there were two particular aspects of this question that I was asked to touch on prior to this debate. One being whether Macron has moved from en marche, this idea of being in movement, in flux, in dynamic, to business as usual. And secondly, to discuss what is seen as his declining popularity. Now I want to take issue, as this is a debate, right? So we've got to take issue with it. I want to take issue with both of these statements for some quite particular reasons. In my opinion, as a candidate, although clearly we've seen an election pretty much unlike any other in Europe in the past few decades. You've got the collapse of established political parties, both on the left and right, for very different reasons in a lot of ways. You see the emergence of a candidate who basically takes the presidency of a large European country from a standing start in about a year, which, as he's a centrist, is kind of slightly obscured exactly how radical that is. In my opinion, as a French watcher, this is actually quite dangerous in a lot of ways. And he fought a presidential campaign in the final round against a Eurosceptic, basically xenophobic and racist candidate. This is pretty serious stuff, right, for a major European country. And within this, my key contention about him and his campaign is that, from where I see France and from where my expertise lie, he never was a candidate en marche. He has always been a candidate which has promoted business as usual. And by business as usual, I mean the absence of a coherent agenda to tackle some of France's most pressing social problems, i.e. the question of ethnic minority, discrimination against ethnic minorities across many facets of French social and economic and political life, and B, the question of the pockets of deprivation in large French cities, which by many different indicators, by people that do much more complex and intelligent sociological research than I do, paints them as the worst pockets of marginalisation in Europe. Okay, so these two questions are actually more or less completely absent, not just from his election campaign, but also from his presidency thus far. Now, why is this important? So one of the key aspects of Macron's presidency thus far, and also one of the key aspects of his campaign, was to come to fore in France as a reformist candidate. And particularly, as my fellow panellists have said, to reform France's unemployment market. And Macron's answer to this has been very much a kind of neoliberal approach to tackling unemployment, almost reminiscent of trickle-down economics, which we know kind of doesn't really work. This idea that a higher tide will float all boats. Okay, so you bring down and you liberalise the economic environment, employment goes up, unemployment goes down, everyone's happy, there isn't a problem. Well, the issue here, for me, lies in the fact that this doesn't really work if the reason you don't have a job in the first place is because you're black or Arab. Now, this is completely absent from not just the campaign, but from French political life more generally. And there are reasons for this. France, as a republic, has written into its constitution that it is illegal to collect ethnic minority statistics or the statistics on the religion of people in France. As far as the state is concerned, you are French, not just first, but second, third, and indeed last. There is no other kind of identity category that politics can be structured on. Okay, great. Individual freedom, everyone's equal. To be honest, sounds like a pretty good deal. Except, if society doesn't treat you like that, then the state doesn't have the political tools really to deal with questions of discrimination. So if the reason you're unemployed, and there are areas that I've done research in Paris and in Marseille, where youth unemployment particularly can run as high as 60%. And this includes people with diplomas and who have finished high school and those who haven't. And the common denominator in these areas is pretty much most people are from an ethnic minority background, either from West Africa or from France's ex-North African colonies. Now, the question of how you deal with these kinds of things, and there's all kinds of sociological research that's been done that shows if you apply for a job in France, entry level, mid-ranking, at the top, people have applied with two different CVs, identical CVs, one with an Arab name with an address in a kind of less salubrious area, one with a white French name and an address in a very nice upper middle class area, and always the person with the right address and the right name gets called for the interview, right? And so far, Macron on Marche has been pretty much unable to even pose this as a particular question. So from where I see France, to tackle this kind of unemployment, especially in this sort of quite marginalised youth population, you need to have a change in policy which, in a sense, Macron has not attempted to tackle. Finally, I want to end on the point, I actually don't think Macron has ever been a very popular president or a popular politician. Macron, there were actually there were votes cast for 3 candidates in the final round of the presidential election. Obviously the 2 official candidates, but a huge amount of votes were spoiled and were just placed in the ballot boxes as an act of protest. There was a massive social media campaign to voter blanc, so to give a blank vote. And these I've seen estimated in the hundreds of thousands. And this, in a sense, demonstrates to me that it isn't that Macron has had a decline in popularity in recent months. It's that he came into office as an extremely unpopular politician who, in a lot of ways, got there because people didn't want, as my panelists have said, didn't want to allow a far-right candidate into office in Europe. And to finish, thus, I think, this leaves him an extremely unlucky politician because he's been elected from both an unpopular standpoint and to take on a question of reform in a country where, no matter who you speak to, everybody wants reform, but they don't want reform to their particular set of privileges. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, I want to bring you in very soon, but I just want to ask perhaps one question that you can all address, and that is on the question of his legitimacy, considering what you just said, and also Naomi, bringing up the statistics of the actual participation in the election, the number of spoiled votes and the low turnout and so on, and the fact that he now has the lowest approval rating since he started his presidency 6 months ago, and also him being posed as a sort of candidate of the young. I mean, being very young himself, but also that sort of the startup nation and the whole fact that France is being run by 30-somethings and so on. But he still had very low approval ratings among the young. Actually, I think Mélenchon and Le Pen got 50% of the youth vote. So. What is his legitimacy, his democratic legitimacy, and can he, will he be able to sort of anchor his politics among the public? What do you think? Anyone? Yeah.
I mean, from my perspective, it seems as if the only candidate that could run for election in France that would have that kind of legitimacy would be Charles de Gaulle. And there is no chance of that happening. I don't think science has quite progressed that far for us to produce another Charles de Gaulle. But this is a really important question because, I mean, the truth is, this is an election that was as much about the rebirth of the far left in France and the success of Mélenchon as it was about the election of anyone else. And it seems to me that a society that, through its current political structure, is becoming increasingly fragmented and divided, and any candidate's going to struggle to have that kind of legitimacy, especially when they come into the field. It seems quite unpopular.
I think what struck me about the last 4 or 5 elections, presidential elections in France, that everyone has almost been elected in some way or another by accident. And there's very much a strong element of that in the election of Macron. It was Fillon was the front runner right up until the Penelope Gate scandal came in, and that was basically what gave Macron basically the motorway to victory at the Élysée. If you think of François Hollande was just this mover and shaker inside the French Socialist Party. He was a rubbish candidate, and the only reason why he won was because everybody just hated Sarkozy so much that he won. If you go back to Sarkozy's victory, part of Sarkozy's victory was down to the fact that Ségolène Royal, who was, she was the president socialist candidate at the time, she was sabotaged by her own party. She was just completely hobbled and sabotaged by some of the most senior members of the French Socialist Party who just didn't want her to win. And they were actually quite happy to spend the next another 5 years in opposition rather than letting Ségolène go in. Jacques Chirac's second mandate was, he won against Jean-Marie Le Pen. So basically, just all through this time, there's always been this. It's something I think which would be very, once again, comparing that to Britain. It's in Britain, people get elected once, twice, Blair, Thatcher, even David Cameron. People either, whether you like them or not, they're approved, or the electorate generally approves of them. They get voted in again. And in France, this doesn't happen. There's always just been this accidental element in French politics. Perhaps I'll just let other people speak. I just wanted to tell you something about the Orange Spheres, because I realised I didn't say it was part of a youth unemployment scheme in order to just get people selling orange juice. And they disappeared after 2 or 3 years and were never seen again. I've always wondered what happened to the spheres. They might be in some trendy loft or something like that, but I just wanted to say that.
Great, thank you, Josh.
I think when you're looking at the question of legitimacy in elections in 2017, 2016, 2015, there is a problem for Macron, of course. He was sort of the least unpopular candidate in some ways. But this is a problem all across Europe. If we look particularly at the Dutch election, at the German election, at last year's Austrian presidential election, in all of these cases you had a bleed away from the old mainstream parties, growing fragmentation of the election result between different parties, and in some of those cases quite high rates of abstention as well. So it's a problem Macron has got to confront, but it's not unique to him. On the questions of his popularity ratings, it strikes me that there are 2 potential alternate histories, and we don't know which one we're in yet. In one of them, Macron's policies are unpopular, Macron is unpopular, he's going to fail, and in 4 years' time they'll boot him out. In the other one, which is the one that Macron would subscribe to, Macron is thinking long-term rather than pandering to the short-term, and that as his policies begin to take effect in a few years' time, his popularity will begin to tick up again. At this point in the curve, we don't know which of those we're in yet, and I don't know which of those we are either.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I agree very much with that. I think his legitimacy, to state the obvious, comes from being president, and the presidency, even if the candidate is quite weak, is so dominating of the whole French political game that the person who occupies the office has a huge amount of power. And I think you're right. His intention seems to be to tough it out and wait until his policies work and not worry about the short term. I think something that probably his fortunes will depend on is whether En Marche proves to be a genuinely popular and new movement rather than just a front for his power, which is what most French parties have been. They've been created by somebody to provide that person with a pedestal. I don't know, maybe other people know better, but I mean, he's obviously trying to control it in detail. He chooses the candidates even in local elections. But on the other hand, it attracted people because it seemed to be a grassroots movement, and which, if it becomes clear that this is simply a front for him, then I think he will lose legitimacy among the people who enthusiastically supported him.
I think the fact that his popularity has gone down quite quickly after the election is quite typical of the French. This does tend to happen after the kind of honeymoon period after whichever president's been elected. So it's not so shocking. And as well, like as we've discussed, all the statistics, all the high abstention rates, obviously, yeah, he didn't convince a lot of French people. It was basically Stop Le Pen getting in. And I think he's probably going about things in the best way he could right now, in that he's got that large majority with his En Marche party. So it's probably the best thing he can do. Whilst his popularity is low, he's just going to have to get on with what he said he was going to do, see if it works, and then, perhaps his popularity will rise again. But I think it's sort of the only option he's got. And I also always get a feeling from Macron, because he has this very kind of kingly air about him, I often get the feeling he really doesn't care if he's popular or not. So.
Okay, thank you.
So how's it working with the En Marche parliamentary candidates? Because that's obviously a massive change to have 50% of candidates from non-political backgrounds, given the fact that French parliamentarians come from a very, unlike Britain, who are very strict, going up through mayoral positions, party positions, to Parliament. So how's that working in terms of you just have a completely different situation? Doesn't that represent a change? The second thing was drawing from Gerry's stuff about employment. I mean, the thing that strikes me about France is the unbelievable resistance to change, and any kind of reform, the change the licensing of taxi cabs in Paris, or change the retirement age by 2 years, blocked Marseille docks for weeks, burning, I mean, just the extent of a reaction to any kind of proposal for change is amazing, and the organisation of interest groups around the sheer question of defence and not of demanding a particular change. So you have these kind of blocks of interest which just have this amazing strength to resist any form of change, which is just incredible. I mean, the employment law clearly doesn't need reforming. It's insane that the postmen do not have a permanent contract. They change every 6 months, and so every 6 months you have someone who doesn't know how to scan a letter, and basically nobody has a job, a permanent job, and there is that kind of, and that's the result of the contract that you're talking about, the permanent contract being so rigid in a way that you don't have that flexibility. So clearly something needs to change. Clearly something needs to change with the taxi cabs in Paris. But because in a way, if the French state and French society did not reform at a time when there was an ideological impulse to reform, and there's no ideological impulse to reform coming from any interest groups in society, there was this kind of immense stalemate, whereby you can't imagine in what legitimacy those reforms would occur. So you just have this sort of like hunkering down of every section of society against any sort of demand for change, but there's no demand for change coming in any kind of rational or any kind of grounded manner, either from the state or from particular interest groups.
My first comment before the question, it is a short comment, might seem a bit facetious, but has it all gone to his head? He's the youngest head of state since Napoleon, and he is married to a cougar. I wonder if that did go to his head. I've seen the consequences of narcissism and ego in high places. Is he going to have a good right-hand man? His predecessor as the youngest head of state, Napoleon, lamented on St. Helena that he perhaps didn't use Marshal Davout, his right-hand man, well, probably because he was jealous of Davout. I can't help wonder if Macron's going to have that problem. Does he have a good team behind him?
Thank you.
I'd like to invite the panel to reject the characterization of Macron's wife as a cougar. I find that quite offensive, and I think it has absolutely nothing to do with his politics or his ability to be president.
So just one thing that I've made a few notes as we've gone along. We're hearing about a president who is affluent, who's resulted as a collapse from the collapse of the left and right. It's a nation in decline, rebirth of the far left, somewhat authoritarian, lack of interest in rights and welfare of minorities, adding to that opening arms to traditional enemies. I sometimes wonder if we're talking about Trump or Macron, and whether or not Macron is simply the darling of the media, whereas Trump is always subject to derision. I just want to caveat by saying I'm a fan of neither of them, but there seems to be a lot of parallels between them as presidential candidates.
I mean, this is an extraordinarily interesting time for French politics. I don't even know where to begin. But I think I think, Nathalie, you said, is there something wrong with Macron's politics? And I think the problem with that is Macron doesn't actually have any politics. I can't remember which speaker said it, but I don't actually think his programme came out until after he'd been elected president. I may have got that fact slightly wrong, but he was basically riding, I think, a coast of sort of an anti-politics thing, which in a sense the other parties were also doing in their kind of anti-establishment type of language. But what's really interesting, I think, now is how far, I mean, the great hope that Mélenchon represented, he seems to be completely at sea at the moment. A couple of demonstrations that he was partly responsible for organising were widely seen as completely having failed. And I feel that there is a huge sense of this great French word, la flemme, at the moment in France. They just can't be bothered. And a real turning off from politics, which Macron is able to effectively manipulate. And the fact that he's got, politicians like, I can't remember his name from Lowe, the Prime Minister. Anyway, someone will help me out with that in a second. Philippe, what's his name? Edouard Philippe, thank you. Who is from a right-wing party, who's effectively abandoned his party to be prime minister, is a very, very interesting reflection of how the kind of the complete collapse of politics. Even the great hope, as it were, for a certain type of people in France, Marine Le Pen, is completely at sea. She doesn't seem to know what she thinks about Europe. That party has just split up after basically split up after having won their biggest vote ever. It's incredibly interesting and chaotic time, but it seems the big problem is that nobody actually has any interesting politics to kind of get rid of the French phlegm at the moment.
Concerning the issue of employment discrimination in France, how exactly would you deal with it? And how would you do it without sort of violating people's rights to choose who they employ and who they spend their time with?
First of all, a small comment. Speaking as a cougar myself, I'm not remotely offended by the use of the term. On the question of the disadvantages faced by the ethnic groups in penetrating the employment market, isn't the answer to that, rather than trying to have more government intervention and working around identities, more to just, it goes hand in hand with the overall liberalisation, where in fact if you open up the market to be more competitive and open, that will actually take away the opportunity for employers to focus on the people they know best, and maybe take risks and actually be compelled to compete in the labour market on a more equal footing.
I'd just like to answer some of those questions that were raised over there, particularly about conservatism in French society. I think I really want to go back to those points about the two types of contract, the CDD and the CDI, because the CDI does literally make you unsackable. I've seen, in my own experience of French working life, I've seen extremes of behaviour which in British society would mean you would be just escorted out the door and thrown on your tot out into the street. And instead of this happening, you actually have the organisers of the unions within the workplace organising general assemblies, calling for strikes, saying that the incident that occurred where an employee in incredibly abusive language insulted his hierarchical superior, it is quite extreme that the unions are able to actually mobilise to an extent that the story is just completely buried underneath the carpet. So that's one point I'd like to make. There is this incredible conservatism which indeed did crystallise around that whole protest of the Premier Embauche. But there is, and now I'd like to go back to where I left off, is about the reaction to the reforms. There are two types of reforms. One is concerning the work, the labour reforms. I suppose the key point in the labour reforms is that if you do sack someone, then the labour courts, which in general in France usually rule for the employee who is claiming unfair dismissal, that they limit drastically the amount of money that the employer has to pay out. Because what happens in France is that because of this particular form of contract, the CDI, they don't want to offer them anymore. I work in an office where most young people who are in their first or the second job are just working on CDDs because the administration and the management just cannot afford to offer a contract which they feel might end up in a form of redundancy or dismissal afterwards. So employers are incredibly conservative in terms of just who they hire, and this goes from big companies down to small ones. Small companies can be extremely sanctioned in an incredibly severe way for a disgruntled employee who the prud'homme, the labour courts, will fine for. But the turnout has been low in these labour protests. So the other one about the civil service reforms. 120,000 posts are to be deleted. It was Fillon wanted 500,000 posts deleted. So Macron's down there with 120. So these create two protests. The unions are all together on the civil service because that's where their membership basically comes from. Union membership in France is actually very, very low by European standards. Union membership is actually lower than it is in the UK, and it's nothing. It's about 7%, nothing compared to in Finland or in Scandinavian countries. So the unions are defending their base. However, there's a division amongst the unions in France about the work reforms, and we've seen this. There were two big days of action in September. There was one on the 12th and one on the 23rd. 5 million civil servants were supposed to come out, first of all, down tools and go out on strike, and a huge percentage of that were supposed to take to the streets. This didn't happen. And I think this is very, very new. This is something extremely new in France. So what is going on? Well, in the times when the Gaullists and the traditional right were bringing in their reforms, well, they're the party of the wealthy, the capitalists, les patrons, they're the party of money. So there was this sort of traditional sort of class element involved in going out and going out on strike, protesting against these reforms. In the case of last year, when the Loi El Khomri, the El Khomri law, which was a very, very, again, just tiny little changes to the labour code, but they were setting coppers on fire on Place de la République. There was the sense of betrayal that got so many people out, because François Hollande came in, just let's remember, François Hollande came in on the promise that he was not the party of the rich. He was against wealthy people. He wanted to bring in a tax of 75% for the biggest fortunes in France. And what did the biggest fortunes in France do? Well, they just went to Belgium, or they went to London, and then the whole thing completely collapsed. The turnout has been very, very low in this because nobody can get a grasp of Macron. This is the thing. He's neither, politically he's non-binary. They cannot get a particular hold on him, and this means that there's a certain kind of, it's destabilized everyone, I think. Okay. It's destabilized everyone, and that's why I think he might be able to, precisely because he's brazening things out in that way, I think he probably might succeed.
Okay, Josh.
On the question of Macron, the egotist, I agree 100% with the lady up there that his marriage has nothing to do with his ability to govern. In fact, by all accounts, his relationship with his wife is one of the very, very few normal relationships the guy actually enjoys. But he is a colossal, his ego is enormous, and it hasn't gone to his head. It was big before. I met him before he was elected. He walks into a room and it's like you're hit by a wall of it. I can't even describe it. He shakes your hand and he looks at you like a sort of, like Jupiter imparting wisdom down from the heavens. And it is extremely beguiling in a way, but also slightly terrifying. Whether that proves to be a positive or a negative for him still remains to be seen, I think. On the question of whether Macron has politics, he does have politics. He had a relatively detailed programme. It came out later than some might have liked, but it was out before the election. He has lots of policy ideas, including for Europe as well as domestically. The problem lies in that his politics is broadly centre-right liberalism or neoliberalism, if you want to call it that. Does that slightly technocratic policy-based approach match up to the vast, sweeping Greek myth-influenced rhetoric that he uses? And is it going to disappoint people when they see the disconnect between those two things?
Thank you. Naomi? And
Yeah.
then you. And then go through.
Yeah, I also wanted to come back on this point about Macron's ego and also some similarities with Trump, which I can see. And I think, yeah, he's clearly got a very big ego. I mean, we heard on the 14th of July, Bastille Day, his refusal to speak to the press was based on the fact that his thoughts were too complex for lowly journalists like us. So I think he certainly thinks a lot of himself, and I do find it very interesting that there are certain aspects of him that are similar to Trump, and yet in the international press, Trump will get such a hard time, whereas Macron is still mainly adored and seen as this still kind of saviour of Europe. I don't know if you remember, again, I think, was it at Bastille? I can't remember, but there was the marching band playing the Daft Punk song, and, you know, Macron's like bopping along, looking really cool, and Trump's just like, don't know what this is. And that was kind of, you know, it was all over social media, like, look how amazing Macron is because he knows who Daft Punk are. And it's just kind of, it's really ridiculous the way they're judged differently, and it's because, as I said before, Macron fits in nicely with this sort of technocratic rule that the EU, for example, really loves, because that's what they do, and so they know how to deal with Macron because he's basically one of them, whereas Trump, of course, is, you know, uncontrollable as far as they're concerned. And then I just wanted to come back on the point about these social problems that we see within French employment, where Arab people or black people are not being able to get the same kind of employment opportunities as white French people. And I mean, whilst I think labour reform is needed in France, I don't think that is going to improve the situation for minorities in France, but I think there are a lot of social problems in France that politicians will not talk about and didn't talk about during the election. And so things like Islamism and the terrorism and extreme Islam, that is a major problem in France, and is seen really clearly in all these terror attacks that have been happening. There's this real avoidance of dealing with it, and again, I mean, Macron's response so far has been just to make these emergency measures. He's removed the state of emergency from France, but just pushed those measures into normal legislation, and that is something that usually French people would not just kind of nod their heads at, say, yeah, okay, they're very proud of their civil liberties, and I think it all comes from this avoidance of talking about some really big problems in France.
Thank you. Robert?
Well, a couple of comments on things that were said. Does he have an able team? He certainly has a very small team of people who've been with him from the beginning, but he's the leader of a mass movement, people who came into politics to do something, and it'll be interesting to see what they're allowed to do, whether this populist, if you like, or this popular wave doesn't collide with his managerial instincts. I remember a French journalist saying that the thing Macron believes is he's the cleverest person in the room. And maybe he is, and therefore maybe he'll bring things off. I think he certainly has a strategy that he believes that the French economy is growing below its proper rate, which is true, and that labour market reforms and cutting of the state can bring it up by a percentage point a year or something like that, and that if that happens, then France's problems will become soluble. Unemployment, the deficit, and so on. And maybe that will work, but it means that quite small reforms have to have very big effects. And particularly, they have to be able to create lots of jobs for them to have an impact on the sort of inequalities that you mentioned. And rather as our way our economy has become used to having a lot of cheap labour, and hence we have a high employment but low productivity economy. The French economy has got fixed in the other extreme of having high unemployment and high productivity. It's quite difficult to see how lots and lots of jobs can be created quite quickly unless the whole economy changes its direction.
Thank you. Yeah, Jess.
Yeah, so I just want to pick up on the comments around what to do about the minority discrimination problem. So to frame that, there's a lot that's been made in France and in the French media about France having a massive radical Islamism problem. Now, fortunately, there's actually very little evidence for this. So if you look empirically at the numbers of French Muslims who've gone to fight with ISIS or have committed attacks on French soil, it's less than 2,000 out of a population of between 6 and 7 million. Right, so empirically there's not a problem. Like Muslim communities across Europe, when you do polls and you ask them what their main kind of identity category is, they actually adhere more to the political identity of the nation state than the sort of native population. So in the UK, Muslims express feelings of being more British than white British people. So that's an important point to make. And it frames, I think, what I'm saying here in that it's not a supply side issue. So Muslims in France do actually want to take part in society and do actually want jobs. Now, the issue here is, I'm also not a fan, actually, of massive state intervention in this regard, especially in the French case. So, you know, my second home city of Marseille recently is attempting to bring in laws in the municipal sense to ban the renting of shops in the city centre to certain kinds of businesses. Mainly, basically, certain kinds of businesses that Muslims start, right? Which is just complete insanity. So I don't think the French state is really very good on these issues. However, I think also in the context of the UK, we need to seriously look at and defend multiculturalism in some ways. I mean, it's become like de rigueur to say that, oh, you know, multiculturalism causes these problems, etc., etc. But anti-discrimination legislation is a good thing. And it's something I think we need to look at and we need to defend. And we should not take so lightly criticisms of these kinds of policies as, you know, on face value. And I think if I was to make policy prescriptions, I'm an academic. It's great. I don't have to make policy prescriptions, right? So I can completely get off here. But if I was, I would say France does need, as a state, to take a role in defending its citizens and defending its citizens from social and economic marginalisation, which can be discrimination, which can be terrible transport infrastructure in places in Paris that are 5 miles from the Champs-Élysées where it would take you an hour and 40 minutes to travel that 5 miles. These are things I think the state needs to deal with. And from the perspective of neoliberalism, a low unemployment rate does not change or does not affect, it seems, from the UK case, the poorer terms and conditions and salaries that women get in our economy. So if you look at the gender pay gap, for example, right, it's still evident even though we are indeed in a high employment economy. So I don't think that just dealing with unemployment necessarily solves these kinds of broader social issues.
Okay.
Thank you.
There's some challenging thoughts. 2000 is quite a shocking figure, I think, but anyway.
I don't think at all that Macron was ever popular, and the election basically showed that it wasn't popular at all. I think the reason why Macron is there is because there was nothing else. Macron is business as usual. If you look at his election, he was talking about Europe. He wasn't about talking about the French, he was talking about Europe, Europe, Europe. And then you have the other side talking about discrimination. How are you going to be able to give an opportunity or an alternative politics to people when you talk about discrimination, which is a minority of people? And at the end of the day, a lot of black and Muslim or whatever are integrated. But there is no alternative to Macron, managerial anti-politics, because I think it's not the political ideas that he has. He's just trying to organize society in a very technical and managerial things. And the other side is just about discrimination. For the first time in my life, I had a lot of friends and family who were interested in politics during this election because of Mélenchon and because of Le Pen. You have black and Muslim supporting Le Pen, not because they necessarily think that, you know, we don't want immigrants in this country, but at least both of them have this idea that we want to fight for the French people. Today, Mélenchon and Le Pen doesn't exist, and you have Macron. And I think that, I don't know, but your discussion is a little bit too much on the, not the discussion, but the discussion in France too much on the either Macron or discrimination. And there is a lot of people who are basically feeling completely out of it, and that's the reason why a lot of my friends and family don't talk about politics anymore. After the elections, it's no more politics. There is nothing else. Mélenchon is gone, Le Pen is gone, and you have Macron.
Briefly to come back on Joseph there, because this question of the divorce of Muslims from French society, because it doesn't quite ring true to me, that, and I think maybe we can't just judge that by the number of people that went to Syria or otherwise, because there does seem to be a wider sort of divorce in French society, especially when you think about how people relate to tradition and French values, and there seems to be very much an empty centre there and very much not something to relate to anymore. But that was just quickly, the main thing I wanted to ask was to come back to Josh's point in your opening remarks about, I think if I got you right, you said that Macron's proposing a vision of the EU and Europe which is much more open and debated. And again, that sort of strikes me as is not really ringing true, because if anything, you can see that over the history of the EU, it's very much been about avoiding debate and avoiding openness, right from its very conception through to more recent times when they've sought to avoid the outcome of national referendums and so on and so forth. So I kind of wanted to ask about that, because I agree with you, it's a kind of interesting move. It doesn't seem to me to be business as usual, but why, from any of the panel, why is it that he's taken, why has he decided to ramp up the European EU thing? What's behind that?
With the collapse of the traditional left in British politics, and I mean, predicting politics is a bit of a fool's game, but potentially the collapse of the traditional British right in the aftermath of Brexit, do you think there's room in British politics for a Macron figure to, launch his own platform and stride through the middle to becoming Prime Minister?
Okay, so my question is about Europe. I was wondering, this anti-establishment sentiment has created this political turbulence all over Europe. And so I was wondering, what are your views in the case of Macron failing to deliver on his pre-election promises about the European reforms? Do you think that there's a possibility of Europe without France? Because from what I have studied, I wouldn't see it. I don't think it would be possible to talk about Europe without France in it. So if French people are frustrated about possible failure of Macron and turn to far right and protectionism and consequently leave Europe, do you think there would be a possibility for the European Union to survive? Thank you.
What we've heard about is that really Macron is there without legitimacy, with the opposition just having left the field, with somebody up there saying people are totally disillusioned with politics. But yet, he is going to be confronting the big issues in French society, not necessarily the racial issues and so on, but the economic issues of contracts and so on, job security, in a way that his predecessors, who were equally presidential in a way, certainly arguably had more support, failed. And they didn't really fail, as I would imagine, because of the opposition in Parliament. It was this whole question of Lowe. Now, we know that in one particular case earlier on this year, that didn't work. But as things build up, surely it's only a matter of time before people who are totally disillusioned with politics, totally unhappy about the way things are going and that their needs are not being met, the Lowe will reassert itself. And I'd be interested with very bad results for Macron, very bad results for France, and I wonder what people's views were about that.
I'm going to be very brief, and I think one alarming statistic that came to my mind through the French election was the when you look at the age demographic, it's so very different when you compare Le Pen's support that came from a very young age group and our equivalent in UKIP and Mr Farage, who I'd take any day over Le Pen, and I'm no supporter of his. And to the future of France beyond Macron, how do those statistics speak to you? Because they seem quite alarming that such a young demographic was in support of Le Pen rather than Macron.
So this might be a bit of a sideline, but I read Varoufakis's book about the Greek situation this summer, about how he got virtually no help from anybody in Europe for Syriza's proposals. The one politician he found in France, and indeed one of the very few politicians in Europe who seemed to be giving him any back end was actually Macron. And it was startling that Macron promised a lot, said he could bring the French in behind him and they would put pressure on the Germans and get some better economic deal for the Greece. It turned out to be an utter failure. I wonder if there's any kind of wider lesson from Macron's proposed sort of French revision of Europe, or French, yeah.
To have a British Macron, you'd have to have a Fifth Republic constitution. Why do the young vote for the Front National more than their elders? Because they suffer more from unemployment. Why is the street impotent at the moment? Because the street is only ever powerful when the government seems vulnerable, which it doesn't at the moment. Why is the European issue so important to Macron? Well, I think it's very important to the whole French establishment that ever since the 1920s, and certainly since the 1950s, France's main national strategy has been to create a Europe in which it and Germany will be the dominant influences. His speech at the Sorbonne suggested he thought that the danger was coming from identity politics, the right, nationalism. And if that did happen, seen from his point of view, it would mean France being weakened, French politics being in disarray, and France's position in the world being undermined. So I think it is very important for him. It's a view that's shared, I think, by the whole French establishment. It's what the French call une pensée unique. Political turbulence in Europe, yeah, all over the West, partly because of the crash, of course, and the after effects of the crash, but also because political loyalties are much more fluid than they were, class, region, religion, and so on. And so the whole of politics everywhere has become much more volatile, and things happen that are unexpected or would have been thought to be impossible. Macron's remedy seems to me, I'm afraid, to be worse than the disease. It's to further increase European centralization of power. In other words, to take it away from national governments in almost every sphere. And his compensation for that is to give our seats, the British seats in the European Parliament, and have them elected on a European-wide list. It just seems to me that that's completely inadequate as a remedy for the democratic deficit in Europe, which his reforms would make much worse.
Thank you so much. Gerry.
Yeah, I'll just answer a couple of questions. I'm not quite sure that he's illegitimate, though, in terms of, in terms of the election. I mean, in the end, I mean, he did win fair and square. So that's, this. I mean, I don't think you'll see the deputies or the MPs from Mélenchon's party actually sort of talking about their own legitimacy with regard to their own election. So, I mean, that's representative democracy. Concerning European reforms, when we talk about concerning Europe, I think it will all depend on whether he is able to push through with his reforms and whether he's going to be able to bring the unemployment rate down, re-dynamize the French economy. Because in the end it will be Germany and Berlin which will decide upon greater European integration or not. There's an incredible story. When he was Minister of Economy, he went to Berlin and he went to see Wolfgang Schäuble, the finance minister, and Angela Merkel, and he said, look, Wolfgang, if you flood the European economy with 50 billion euros, we will make 50 billion in savings in the French economy. And it was a sort of a WTF moment in Berlin where they said, well, no, we don't think we'll do that at all. And I think at the end, in the end, when we're talking about the European Union, we're really talking about implicitly about what Berlin will decide. I think there are actually some positive things going on in France. There's the Projet de Grand Paris, huge infrastructural changes going on in France, and the suburbs in France are really excited about this. New metros, new train lines, all sorts of infrastructural changes going on, and you really do get that sense of excitement in the suburbs about this. So that's one positive thing. I think that, indeed, I agree that Macron is part of that whole wave of discontentment that has been expressed in so many different ways by Brexit, Trump, even the Catalonian referendum. It's part of this thing that people want the lines to move, and although he might seem like a technocrat with a huge ego, he is actually part of that phenomenon. People are fed up and they want things to change. So to a certain extent, there's something positive in that the fact that lines are moving and things are being shaken up. I would insist again that if he gets unemployment down 3% in the next couple of years, although I understand very well the skepticism that has been expressed about that, he'll be considered as a genius because, as I said, that unemployment line has just been absolutely straight for the last few years. And the thing is, the other thing that destabilizes the unions and the street is the fact that he was actually elected to do all this. And I think the electorate are waiting for that, and I think, that's probably, his presidency will stand or fall on that. Opinion polls, I wouldn't trust them so much all the time, although I always actually giggle to myself when I think of François Hollande's last opinion approval rating, which was 4%. You know, it was 4%. So Emmanuel Macron's a long way away from that. I'd be suspicious polls also about, you'll see the polls in France where people approve strikes. The majority of people approve the civil servants going out or approve workers going out. But you have to think of that notion in France of the principe de solidarité. It's very much, there's a sort of an omerta in France. You can't complain about strikes. You can't, I mean, strikes really drive people, everyone nuts. But there is a sort of a principle of solidarity which is very central to French culture, so people don't talk about it that much. But I think that most people are actually hoping, I would say the majority of people are probably hoping that he wins the battle against the unions.
Thank you. Great. Final 2 minutes.
Loads of really interesting questions there. I'll try and answer them really quickly. Could you have Europe without France? Who knows? It would be wildly destabilizing, and probably no. But I also think we're quite some way from getting there, particularly the complete implosion of the National Front since the election suggests that we may be less likely than we once were to see that. Why do the young vote far right in France and in many other European countries and not in Britain? I've been thinking about this a lot recently. I don't know the answer. I asked the question on Twitter the other day. Some smart people came back. One of the more interesting proposals was this fact that there is still a sort of a stronger and more valuable social democratic settlement in France and some of these countries, and therefore it is easier to say to people, well, these people are coming in and stealing your stuff from the state. And that sort of appeals more to young unemployed people in France than in Britain, where young unemployed people don't get much anyway from the state. On the question of his European reforms, Macron is broadly, he's a pro-European. He's pretty happy with the EU. He has two problems with it. One of them, he's correctly identified that many people are unhappy with it. And the other one, he thinks that on the kind of Franco-German axis, the Franco part of that has been dipping down and the German part has been dipping back up. And so his reforms are kind of tweaks, really, to fight back against that. He also talks a lot about democracy. I think Robert's right that in terms of what he's done so far, there isn't that much to significantly correct the democratic deficit. And finally, could there be a British Macron? No, not right now, for two reasons. One, first past the post and the lack of a president. So new parties are always harder to get through, and there is no equivalent way to shoot in over the top of Parliament like Macron did. But imagine if we had a Britain where, say, the monarch was got rid of and we had an elected monarchy. It's interesting to imagine who would be the British president. I think it might be someone like Jamie Oliver or Gary Lineker, perhaps. I don't know.
Okay. Naomi.
I'm really hoping that doesn't happen. I would hate to see Jamie Oliver be Prime Minister. So I wanted to come back on what Joseph was saying about terrorism as well, and which someone brought up as well. And I think I'm not suggesting anyway that there's a majority, the majority of Muslims in France are extreme in any way, but it's a lie to say that there isn't a problem with extreme Islamism in France. And beyond that, it's also something that you really have to put in historical context, that there has been a problem with immigration coming into France from North Africa and being kind of properly integrated into France for since the 60s. And this is just an ongoing problem that has not been dealt with. And so, I just think it's a lie to say that there aren't issues there. There are huge tensions in a lot of the suburbs. Anti-Semitism is rising, and the tension with Muslims in France is part of that. So there are some really big social problems there that need addressing and that aren't being. Yeah, the youth vote and sort of voting for Le Pen, I think let's not forget Mélenchon, because a lot of young people voted for Mélenchon as well. And I think part of that is the high youth unemployment, which has been said. I think also, with regards to the Front National, younger people don't necessarily think so much about the past, about the history of Jean-Marie Le Pen and all of the kind of Holocaust now. They weren't there for it, so it's just not such a big deal for them, whereas older French people will not forget that and will not forget Jean-Marie Le Pen getting through to the second round. Sure, okay, just a final point then. I think Macron and Macron's election is an element of this kind of anti-politics wave across Europe that we're seeing at the moment, which we're seeing in other countries, and we saw with Brexit here. And I hope it will end up being positive for France and that he will manage to change some things for the better, but I'm not holding my breath.
Excellent, thank you.
Final 2 minutes.
Yeah, I think some of the things that have come up in the debate and the Q&A actually, for me, tie a lot of the issues with the issues that I have with the Macron presidency together quite well. And I'll start that by saying that there's a lot that's said again about the sort of divorce of Muslim populations from broader French society. So it's said both in the press in France, in everyday kind of anecdotal conversations that one can have on the streets of French cities. Yet, when you dig a little bit deeper, to try and substantiate what that actually means is never, to me, adequately done. So it's never empirically evidenced to me in ways that convince me that it's necessarily the case. And having spent a lot of time working in places where a lot of Muslims in France live, it's not something that I see occurring necessarily on a day-to-day basis. And I'll use an example to illustrate this that also, for me, critiques Macron's presidency and also demonstrates some of the paradoxes of sort of cultural or racial explanations for some of France's problems. So, to me, a lot of the problems that occur in the suburbs of French cities relate to them being vectors of insecurity. So in the same sense that, although they're not exactly the same, but in the same sense as some parts of American cities populated by African Americans or Latinos aren't particularly very well policed, and there are places where large amounts of violence occurs. If you call the police, they may or may not come. They don't really adequately investigate crimes and stuff like that. In the same way, a lot of the large estates on the edges of French cities are just places where the police do not go. Now, for me, that's a public policy issue. That kind of insecurity, the toleration of disorder in certain places, a kind of Bantuization of parts of French cities, to me is a public policy issue. So if you're the police and you say to me, there is a no-go zone, you're not doing your job, in a sense, right? You are the coercive arm of the state has legitimacy to exercise coercion, and you're not doing it. To me, it's a public policy issue, right? But, in a sense, these places where disorder is and where vectors of insecurity exist, and importantly, where you can buy a Kalashnikov for around 400 to 500 euros if you have the right telephone number. I can't provide you with that telephone number, I should add, okay, in case anyone's interested. This is where the arms that enabled the sort of small number of terrorists that have struck France in recent years, this is where their arms have come from. It's this issue of organised crime, which isn't necessarily a Muslim issue, which stretches back to much broader issues of French organised crime, Corsican organised crime, for many sort of generations, is deemed as some kind of Muslim issue, where the structures that lead to this kind of insecurity to occur, to me, don't seem to have a religion, but seem to be more structural and more of a public policy and policing problem.
Okay, thank you so much. Could we thank the speakers one final time?